All right, Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another sermon here at Nazarene Way Church, where we are starting in the humble beginnings as a house church, and then we are growing and we are restoring the original religion of Jesus the Nazarene. This is pre-Gentile Christianity, pre-Catholicism, pre-all of that. So today what we're going to do is our sermon, instead of it being heavily focused around Catholic bashing, which no offense to my Catholics out there, but I'm just essentially relaying and sharing some of the research and some of the findings that we have found and discovered. There's a group of us that are essentially excavating a lot of this long-lost literature and these long-lost phenomenal facts relating to the early formation of Jesus's religion, his following, and all of that stuff. So unlike my previous sermons the last 2 weeks, we're going to spend a little bit less time on the actual Catholic bashing and a little bit more time on the discussion around what do the Nazarenes actually believe? What does it mean to actually walk in the way? Walk in the footsteps, walk in the way of Jesus the Nazarene. And what do we actually believe? Are we Nazarenes? Are we Christian? No. Are we Jewish? No. Then what are we? So that's what we're going to focus on in today's sermon. And I'm going to share with you the core beliefs that we as Nazarenes, and by the way, before I get any further, when I say Nazarene, I'm not talking about the typical term you think of or the typical concept you think of when you hear the term Nazarenes and a Nazarene church. You see, there's a popular church out there called like the Church of the Nazarenes, and they're actually what they are is they're essentially a Baptist church, and they come from I believe it's the Wesleyan tradition of Baptists, and that group of Baptists in the Wesleyan, church, which I think dates to maybe like the 19th century. They have essentially used and hijacked the term Nazarene for their own purposes, wherein the Nazarene term, Jesus the Nazarene, right, was in use long before then. 2,000 years before they started essentially using and hijacking the term, these group of Baptists, right? And we know this because we have all of the records from the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century and 4th century and 5th century literature from a lot of the patristics, the church fathers, who declared the Nazarenes as a separate group and like the original followers of Jesus, right? The disciples who walked with him. They were known as the Nazarenes. And when I say Nazarene in Nazarene Way Church, what I'm talking about has nothing to do with the Nazarene Baptist Church, right? The modern day Church of the Nazarene, right? Or even Point Loma, the Nazarene, which is a college down here in Southern California. When I say Nazarene, it has nothing to do with that. When I say Nazarene and Nazarene Church, we are essentially on a mission to restore and essentially revert back and fork back. If you're familiar with GitHub programming, and code bases, we're essentially going back to the original code base, wherein the original fork of Jesus's religion, where they called themselves, the Nazarenes, and those internally they called themselves disciples of the way. And you can read about this in Acts, the people of the way, those who walk the way, capitalized way, right? That's the original code base of Jesus. His real name was Yeshua, of his religion, and those who walked with Jesus, meaning his disciples, right? Then there was a nice little first big fork in the road, which this guy who never walked with Jesus, never knew him, named Paul, essentially forked off and created a pathway, a branch off of that code base, and that became known as Christianity. And then, in the early days, Catholicism, and then there's Orthodoxy, and then, later on in Martin Luther in the 1500s, I believe it was, forked off of it again, and there's been, there's tons of branches, and everyone's just forking off of the original OG tradition and religion that Jesus believed and ascribed to. And Jesus, if you looked at what he believed, Jesus wasn't creating a fork off of the Hebrew, Israel, Judean religion, right? Jesus followed and was a Hebrew, right? So what we are doing here at Nazarene Way is forking back and going back to the OG source, and that's what carves essentially and shapes our belief. And so with that being said, I'm going to talk today about what do we, as the restorers of the Nazarene tradition, what do we actually believe? Well, I'm going to lay it out for you. The first thing we believe in is really quite simple. It's the first commandment of the 10 Commandments, right? We believe in one God, right? And what's fascinating and it's a bit ironic is that we believe in one God. We follow the first commandment of believing in one God. Yet, if you look at modern day Catholicism and Christianity, they don't believe in one God. They believe in a three-God, pagan idea of three gods, essentially, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, aka the Trinity, right? Which was invented in I believe it was the 2nd century by a man named Tertullian, who called it Trinitas in Latin, and later defected from the Catholic Church. So in reality, the Trinity, which is a bit ironic, is actually an idea from a quote-unquote heretic, as the Catholics would call him, who left the Catholic Church and the Catholic tradition. So we don't believe in the Trinity. Jesus never spoke of the Trinity. The Trinity is never in the Hebrew Bible, which is the only Bible in Scripture that Yeshua used, which is made up of the Torah, of the prophets, and of the writings, right? That's the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of Moses, that's called the Torah. This is known as the Tanakh. This is what Jesus knew. In Jesus' literature that he used, he never once conceived of or used the idea of the Trinity. It's not in there, right? And that's the first thing we Nazarenes believe in. There's no Father, there's no Son, there's no Holy Spirit that are 3 separate gods that form one God. No, that's an odd idea formulated, over hundreds of years by people that, essentially through hearsay and a game of telephone kind of crafted and recreated their own version of a 3-God system known as the Trinity. We don't believe that. We believe in one God. It's really quite simple. The second thing we believe is we hold that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of Man. Jesus referred to himself and he called himself Ben Adam, meaning son of. Ben means son of, and then Adam, just like Adam, man. Ben Adam, I am the Son of Man, right? And we see that throughout Mark, throughout the earliest written gospel. He never called himself the Son of God. He called himself the Messiah, the Son of Man. The man that walked the talk and came to restore the actual true message of the Hebrew Bible, of the Tanakh. The Hebrew Bible, whenever any scribe or any high priest gets their hand on it, any Orthodox, group gets their hands on it, it kind of goes wayward. And the Messiah, Jesus the Nazarene, came to restore the original nature and focus of Judaism, right? Love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And that is what we believe. We believe that Jesus was not a God-like deity, the Son of God pagan idea that was concocted and crafted later on. And we see evidence in our texts of this, right? And the Ebionites, which was later, the Nazarenes were later on referred to also as the Ebionim or Ebionites, which means the poor one. We find evidence in their writings that they believed that Jesus was also not the Son of God. He was not some godlike figure. He was the Messiah, and he was righteous because he walked the way. Not through faith, not through some, essentially Pauline idea of all you have to do is, say and profess, I believe that, Jesus is the Son of God and you'll go to heaven. That's not, Jesus never said that once. That's Paul's idea. What we know from the disciples and how the disciples viewed Jesus and the disciples' descendants, we knew that they believed that Jesus was a man. He was anointed at the baptism of John the Baptist and just open up Mark. That was the first written gospel, Mark. A dove came down and essentially anointed him, right? And that is when he became essentially the Messiah. Now, one is not redeemed by just declaring and thumping their Bible in a Baptist church and saying, oh, I believe in Jesus as the Son of God. I'm redeemed, right? Jesus never said that. He never fought for that. One is redeemed and gains salvation and attains the kingdom of heaven, which we know from the Gospel of Thomas is within you and without you, through walking the way, capitalized way. And by that, it means action matters more than faith. How you walk, how you actually carry out the Spirit and the laws that Jesus made very clear that are present in the Hebrew Bible, that matters more than faith. So, the next thing is this. The third thing we stand for and believe is that having boots on the ground and actually taking care of the poor is of utmost importance. That is our highest value. That is what we are called to do. And we even know this. You can read this. It's if you actually open your eyes to this fact and you start reading the quote-unquote New Testament with this new lens that I'm giving you, you'll start to see it everywhere. Like in Galatians 2, verse 10, Paul, basically is talking about, Paul was essentially chastised, okay? And he's talking about how, James the Just, the brother of Jesus, the actual biological brother of Jesus, and Peter and John, who were called the pillars of the Jerusalem church, the first Nazarene church in Jerusalem. Paul says they, the three pillars, like James, led by James, asked only that we remember the poor, something that I was eager to do, right? So what Paul is talking about is Paul was chastised and told, okay, but here's what you need to do. And also, you need to make sure, Paul, that you remember the poor. And then Paul, in his egotistical sense and way about him goes, oh, I was only eager to do that and take care of the poor. Well, if that was actually the case, Paul, then why are you being chastised and told that this is what you must do, right? It's because Paul wasn't actually caring for the poor. He wasn't focused on the poor, right? The Ebionim, the Ebionites, right? The poor ones. He was creating and concocting some dogmatic religion, for his own benefits, for his own, essentially, gain. And so he was chastised by the brother of Jesus and said, you need to start caring for the poor. And Paul's like, oh, I was only eager to do that, right? Trying to save face, essentially. We know that, the Ebionites, they were called the poor ones, the Ebionim, and they took pride in that. They adopted an ascetic lifestyle that didn't revolve around buying multi-million-dollar mansions with private jets and, 8 exotic cars, just like Joel Osteen, just like your typical Christian Pauline pastor out there. No. The focus of the Nazarenes, as is made clear by James the Just, and the OG disciples is made very clear. Take care of the poor ones. Our focus is on the poor ones. And how you should instantiate this, if you decide to walk the way with me and become a Nazarene, is you actually have to put boots on the ground. No, it's not just about cutting the check to the poor one or to some charity. It's about going out on your own, on missions, and taking care of the poor, doing something nice, looking into the homeless person's eyes, and doing something amazing for them. About a month ago, I think it was a month ago, I went with a friend of mine. He was also a fellow Nazarene named Cam, who is the co-director of Christspiracy. I recommend you check it out at Christspiracy.com. And, we, with the Nazarene Way Church funds, bought $1,000 worth of pizzas that are vegetarian, which we'll come back to. And we gave out pizza boxes to the homeless, to people that were stepping over the homeless on the sidewalk. We walked up to them, asked them what their name was, got to know them, gave them pizza, and treated them like a human being. That is what the purpose of religion is supposed to be about. That is what Jesus fought for. That is what he died for and was crucified for. And yet, in the ultimate form of irony, instead of us actually following that message and doing that and caring for the poor, what we do instead is essentially we create a pagan-like deity and do idol worshiping, which violates the second commandment, and praise Jesus as a godlike figure, which is the exact opposite of what he stood for and fought for. So we as Nazarenes, what we do on a regular basis, we do some crazy undertaking to go and care for the poor ones ourselves by going into our closets and gathering old clothes and finding and going on a mission, finding the poor ones and giving them clothes, giving them supplies, talking to them and caring for them on a regular basis. That is what we do. That is what we stand for. So, the fourth belief is this, is that our canon is, meaning our group of texts that we use, is really quite simple. If you ask yourself, hey, well, do you have a Bible? We say, yeah. Our Bible is the same Bible that Jesus used. It's the Tanakh. It's the Hebrew Bible. That is what we use. Now, we read it with a very careful eye because there was a lot of scribes and orthodoxy injected in there later on throughout, hundreds of years, right? So we have to read it with a very careful eye, which is why it's kind of hard to be a Nazarene, quite frankly, because you have to read a ton to develop a scholarly eye for how to read and parse these texts. The other group of texts that we use, so we use the Tanakh. The other one that we know the Nazarenes and Jesus and his disciples used is called the Gospel of the Hebrews. And, we unfortunately, that's lost to us. Essentially, what it's purported to be is it's purported to be essentially the Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew, but it did not have the first two chapters of Matthew, which contained the virgin birth and, which was essentially a later on idea prepended into, the story and narrative of this pagan deity of Jesus Christ that, the Christians invented. We don't believe in the figure of Jesus Christ necessarily, right? We don't use the term Christ, right? That's a Greek idea. That's a Greek word, Christos. In its most purest sense, Jesus' name was Yeshua, Yeshua the Nazarene, Yeshua the Messiah, right? And so, as far as our canon goes, what do we use? The Bible? Well, we use the Tanakh. We use the Gospel of the Hebrews, or the remnants of that. Here's until we have that, you can get a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew and just cut out the first two chapters, okay? We also use as reference points the Clementine literature, which, they call the pseudo-Clementine literature, right, as a way to, make it seem less authoritative. The Catholics do. It's kind of essentially a cover-up and an ops, essentially movement to call it the pseudo-Clementine literature, when in fact all of the Gospels and most of the books in the New Testament were also pseudonymous. We don't know who the author actually is, besides Luke and Acts, right? So we also read and look to the Clementine literature for wisdom. We also look to the Didache. We also look to the Gospel of Thomas, and there's a lot of other sources that they call the apocryphal sources, the apocryphal literature, the Catholics call it that we also read with a very careful eye to extract with a scholarly eye, doing, hermeneutics, criticism, critical reading, exegesis, it's called, right? And we do that to unearth the true message and to try to peel back the layers that were essentially ensconced and covered in medieval dogmatic Christian writings. We kind of try to rip that apart with a critical scholarly eye to unearth the true teachings in the way of Jesus the Nazarene. So that is essentially our canon. Our canon is, the best canon is essentially no canon. The best canon we can use is reading all canons and reading the canon of Jesus the Nazarene with a very critical eye and not turning it into some inerrant word of God, because the Hebrew Bible, especially the New Testament, is filled with scribal errors, and you can reference and check out Bart Ehrman for that. His book Misquoting Jesus is a fantastic reference to go to see all of the hilarious errors that scribes made that were then carried forward, through generations, right? The next big thing that we ascribe to and believe is we hold dearly the value and the practice and the way of vegetarianism. So the Nazarenes and the Ebionites were vegetarian. Believe it or not, the thou shalt not kill, as shocking as this may seem, that applied not only to humans but to animals as well. And we know from Hegesippus in the 2nd century, and his words are preserved by the church father, the man who basically documented the history of the Catholic Church in the 3rd century. I'm talking about Eusebius in ecclesiastical history. We know from Hegesippus, it's quoted, that James, the brother of Jesus, drank no wine or strong drink, meaning the Nazarite vow, right? Nor did he eat meat. No razor touched his head. He did not anoint himself with oil, and he did not use the bath. He alone was permitted to enter the holy place, meaning the temple, for he did not wear wool but linen. He used to enter the temple alone and be found kneeling on his knees and praying for the forgiveness of the people. Right? That is Jesus' biological brother who he grew up with. We can also assume, which we'll get there in a second, we'll talk about Jesus and whether or not he was a vegetarian. So we know that Jesus' biological brother was a vegetarian. And here's also something that we know. And we know this from essentially the Ebionites and their words. And in the Ebionites, we have in Mark 1, verse 6, we have this written about John the Baptist. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. So the word locusts, that seems odd. Who eats grasshoppers and wild honey? We know from the word that was actually used there was an interpolated error, wherein locusts doesn't mean grasshopper. It means this honey cake. That's what he ate, this manna-like bread. And there was this mistranslation, this interpolation, wherein the Aramaic word that was used, and then, in Hebrew that was used, was mistranslated when it went to Greek, and then when it went to Latin, then when it went to English, it just doesn't make sense. And we know from the Ebionites, they said, no, he ate honey cakes, this honey manna, right? And we know from John the Baptist and how he lived, he did not. He was a vegetarian. We also know from the Gospel of the Ebionites, and this is preserved thanks to Epiphanius, Angry Epi we call him, who is an early church father, Catholic church father, who was a psychopath against heretical groups. And in the ultimate form of irony, he declared that the Ebionites and the Nazarenes were heretical. The original people who walked with Jesus was heretical. In their version of the Last Supper, he's talking about the Nazarenes and Ebionites, Jesus says, I have come to abolish the sacrifices, and if you do not cease from sacrificing, meaning slaughtering animals, goats, all of this, the wrath of God will not cease from you. And we know that the whole, if you're brought up in the church and Christian tradition, you're brought up to think that, oh, yeah, Jesus ate wine because he turned water into wine, right? And Jesus ate fish because he, multiplied and created fish. But if you actually look, if you can watch Christspiracy for this, if you actually look at the word fish that was used, was not fish, it was relish. And Jesus, when he talks about, that moment, he only mentions the bread. So that is also likely a misnomer. Jesus likely was just like his biological brother, and just like his, essentially the guy that anointed and baptized Jesus, John the Baptist, they were all vegetarian. So was Jesus. So that is what we believe, and that's what I am. I'm a vegetarian, right? It started very slowly. You have to start slowly. So we strive to be, and we encourage those to adopt a vegetarian lifestyle. That is a core value of being a Nazarene. And a year ago, I was not a vegetarian. A year ago, I'd have been like, there's no way. I recommend you start small, start in one day. Start just one day at a time. It's a lot easier than anything else. It's a heck of a lot easier if you have a nightly habit of, having a glass of wine. It's a heck of a lot easier to give up than a glass of wine, right? Which brings me to the next thing, is there's something called the Nazarite Vow, which is outlined in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Numbers. The Nazarite Vow is something else that we also ascribe to. The Nazarite Vow is optional. I have taken it. I've taken the Nazarite Vow, and I'm a Nazarite, I guess you could say, as well. The Nazarite Vow is basically three things. Number one, no wine. Also, no grapes, meaning no grapes at all too, because I guess it's a form of like luxury, right? And no strong drink. So initially, when I took the Nazarite Vow, I started with no wine, and I used to only drink wine. It was hard for me to give up. But then I was like, oh, okay, well, it doesn't specify anything besides wine, right? So I started drinking like a nightly little whiskey every single night. But then I read it even closer, and it says no strong drink. And I tried to argue with ChatGPT and translators for about a month until I realized that, you know what, no, it's right. Strong drink also includes, things like whiskey. So finally, I gave up strong drink. And for, I don't know, it's been 6 months at least, I have been, alcohol-free. There's fantastic alcohol-free beers out there, by the way. And it's really quite easy. You'll be shocked with what it does to your life, how it transforms your life if you give up alcohol. So that's part one of the Nazarite Vow. There's three things. Part two is no cutting of the hair. We know this of the Nazarite Vow. Don't cut your hair. So I have not cut my hair as well, which is quite nice. You save a lot of time, trying to focus on your, hairstyle, or going to, essentially, the barber, right? Save a ton of time, right? It's been quite nice. The other thing is, and this is, so that's it, essentially it. You may have noticed I've grown a beard as well. That seems to be optional. The beard and having no razor, it comes from Leviticus 21:5, which is probably a high, priest scribal source. And, they shall not make bald spots upon their heads. So no razors, basically. A beard is, you don't have to grow a massive long beard, right, to follow the Nazarite Vow. It's optional. A lot of Jewish people did grow it. What you can't do is you can't shave with a razor, just like the Egyptians, just like pagans, shave their heads bald, shave their beards bald, right? We don't do that. So basically, no wine or alcohol, no cutting of the hair, and the third one is simple, no funerals, meaning you can't be near a dead body. Okay, that's taking the Nazarite Vow, which we know James the Just did, probably Jesus did as well, probably John the Baptist did as well. But we know for a fact James, the brother of the Lord, they call him, the Catholics call him, but James, biological brother of Jesus, took the Nazarite Vow and was a vegetarian. The other thing we know that is dear to the Nazarenes is water immersion. So if you have an open running stream of water, regularly immerse yourself and, immerse yourself in water. It cleanses you, and use it as a symbol to essentially be born anew. So that's what we also ascribe to and believe. And then last but not least is holidays. You ask us what holidays we believe is, it's really quite simple. We don't practice any of these pagan holidays like Oester, which is Easter, that's a pagan holiday, or essentially the winter solstice, the pagan holiday of Christmas, right? And with the trees and the old Yule, right? That's a pagan holiday, so we don't essentially practice that. It's really quite simple. Go to ChatGPT and say, hey, ChatGPT, what holidays did Jesus himself practice? And that's the holidays that we practice. So they're Hebraic roots, Hebrew holidays, right? Judean holidays. And that is what we practice. So I'm going to go through this as a summary again. I'm going to just list it off. How do you become a Nazarene? Number one, you believe in one God. Number two, you hold that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of Man, not some godlike, pagan-like deity, right? We hold that the most important thing is to take care of the poor through our action, through boots on the ground. The third thing is that our canon is Yeshua's canon. We follow the law and still stick to the Hebrew Bible. And we use many other texts, and we read it with a critical scholarly eye. The fifth thing is vegetarianism. We are vegetarians. We ascribe to that. If you become a Nazarene, it is highly, highly, highly encouraged that you adopt a vegetarian lifestyle. So, next on the list is the Nazarite Vow. The Nazarite Vow is optional. The Nazarite Vow entails no alcohol, no strong drink, no wine, no grapes, no cutting of the hair, and no funerals. Next, water immersion and water baptism is a core of what we believe. And last but not least, as far as our holidays go, we celebrate the same exact holidays that Jesus the Nazarene celebrated. If you want to walk the way, that is what it means to become a Nazarene. That is what it means to walk the way. So hopefully that provides some clarity for you. And I will see you in next week's sermon, where we will continue to restore the original source, the original religion, or the original way of Jesus the Nazarene. Peace and love.